Hello and welcome to this episode of EMCC in Focus. In these informal conversations, we have chats with activists, campaigners, researchers, individuals and organisations working across Scotland's media, creative, cultural, arts and sports sectors. The focus of the conversations is different areas of inequality, and we try to talk about both the barriers and also some of the solutions to make sure that we can uphold everybody's right to participate in Scottish media and culture. My name is Miranda. I'm the project manager of the Equal Media and Culture Centre for Scotland, or EMCC. And this episode, I am delighted to welcome Amina Shah, who's joined us from the National Library of Scotland. She's the CEO and also our national librarian. So Amina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Miranda. Thanks.
Oh, we're delighted to have you. We actually have the Glasgow Women's Library who sit on our advisory group, and we're really big fans of libraries over here. So we're really glad that you can join us. We're going to ask you a few questions about your career and also your thoughts on sort of cultural leadership in Scotland. But I should mention first that part of the kind of context of this conversation is EMCC's recent report, Diversity at the Top, which you can find on our website and is also going to be linked in the show notes. It's the first kind of, I suppose, comprehensive analysis of leadership in Scotland across the media and culture sectors, and it kind of specifically examines sex and race, so really kind of interrogating who is sitting in those leadership spaces, those decision-making spaces across the country. I'd also like to mention that there is a data error in the original report. Specifically, there's an omission of a woman of colour in theatre leadership. So we'd like to apologise for that and also to say that it has been rectified and is now accurate. So we're going to focus today on the section of the report that examines 48 of our key national cultural bodies. So, for example, Publishing Scotland, Chamber Music Scotland, and of course, the National Library of Scotland. And one of the findings from the report is that of these, from the 48 kind of key cultural national bodies, 50% of the board positions across these are held by women, which is fantastic. It was a really great finding. It's really welcome. Unfortunately, it's always a bit more complicated than that, but the representation of people of colour is not so good, and half of the boards have no people of colour on them at all. For the CEOs, we found that 44% of the CEOs were women, which is, again, not too bad, but only 2 of those are led by people of colour. So with that in mind, we're really lucky to have Amina here today to chat through some of the findings and also the significance of cultural diversity across the board in Scotland. Amina, I know you hold degrees in literature and also librarianship, and you've held positions at St Andrews in Dundee, SLIC, the Scottish Library and Information Council, and also the Scottish Book Trust. You're also the first woman and I think person of mixed heritage to hold the position at the National Library of Scotland, which is, I think, in 100, is it nearly 100 years?
Yeah, that's right. So the library will be 100 in 2025. Yeah.
Ah, okay, coming up. So you're going to oversee that, which is pretty cool. So I wonder if you can talk us through some of the key points in your career. I suppose I'm thinking particularly for those early in their career, perhaps in this sector, who are looking to kind of progress, and what some of the sort of key stepping stones were to your role in the National Library of Scotland.
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually when I think about looking back, because when you're starting your career, you can't really predict what's going to happen, what opportunities there are. So I think you often think you might have an idea of where you're going, but often, what is it John Lennon says, life gets in the way of making up plans. So
that's right.
that tends to be what happens. I mean, my primary just love was for literature, and I went to study literature at Dundee University, and I was living in Leeds at the time. That was just my primary thing. I just wanted to I didn't really think about a career path in that sense. And then I went to just followed, I just went to Glasgow and followed where my boyfriend was going, actually. Maybe not a great idea for people to take.
Feminist leadership.
After graduation. I hesitate to even suggest that as a reason. But, I just went to live in Glasgow and got a job in the library at the University of Strathclyde. And then I realised that there was an avenue, a possibility to do a postgrad in library and information studies. And I worked in Waterstones in the bookshop at the time, and did my postgrad, and it was a really fantastic time. It was around 1997, so a long time ago now. And then after that, I got a job in the Mitchell Library, which is in fact actually where my parents met decades
Oh,
before, and sort of an odd crossing of paths, if you like. So my dad was a
yeah.
foreign student to come over from Pakistan, and my mum was Glasgow born and bred and working in the library, and so they met in that way. So it was nice that I worked there. Again, I didn't particularly think of, even at that point, where am I going, what's the possibilities, and I didn't, never occurred to me about things like the National Library or anything else. I worked at the Mitchell for a while, and one of the earliest digitisation projects, Sir Thomas Lipton Archive, and then I went to work for Jordan Hill, which is Teacher Training College Library, and eventually I moved to Dundee, and I got a job there in the public library and worked there for 14 years, which I absolutely adored working there. Lots of different projects with the community. There was a real time of change. We were doing lots of outreach work and changing a lot. And also in that time, I had 4 children. So I was on 4 maternity leaves, and my focus was not about my career. It was just, getting on with my life. I absolutely loved my job. I was really interested in it and involved in lots of various other offshoot things as well. I always worked full time as well, just out of necessity. And there's lots of things now that we have available, like flexi time, etc., and flexible working. There wasn't really opportunities for any of that, and also I didn't have any family around, so I needed to afford childcare. So there's a lot of things going on at that time. I certainly wasn't trying to think about career progression. I was just, just loved what I was doing. And then I went to work for Slick in Glasgow, Scottish Library and Information Council, which involved quite a hefty commute, which was quite tricky. But at that time, I also joined the board of the National Library of Scotland, and that was in 2015 when I was first appointed on the board. And that was when I noticed about diversity on boards. So it was really occurred to me at that point that there was an issue. I was approached by SEMVO, which are the Equalities Mainstream Organisation in Scotland, and asked about, could we speak to you because you are one of 13 people on a civil service appointed board in Scotland that are from an ethnic minority background. And I didn't have any clue that there was such a lack of diversity. And I think it's improved a lot now. And I think I noticed from your report that, things have changed and improved. But that was when it really first came to my attention. And yeah, it's interesting because my route to it, I suppose, was through just my love of literature and going down that line, ending up working in libraries, etc. It was accidental, but had I not joined the board at that point, I don't think I would have actually realised how many cultural organisations are run by boards, and secondly that how important boards are in terms of the leadership of organisations. And since then, I've been involved in lots of different boards. So I've been involved in boards of Stanza Poetry Festival, Horsecross Arts. I'm involved in CILIP, who's the library profession, and also on the advisory board for the British Library, on the advisory board for Common Purpose, and I'm on the court of Dundee University. But I do think that it's a little known thing amongst people who are just like I was, busy getting on with your life, busy working, busy dealing with other things that are going on, that actually this is how things are managed.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's certainly something that I've reflected on recently. I've recently joined the board of Stellar Quines and become suddenly much more aware of the role that boards are playing, and can play in lots of different ways in terms of the direction of the organization and the kind of expectations that are set out from the top as well. I know that, yeah, I mean, you mentioned some of the kind of key leadership positions on all these kind of very significant academic and indeed cultural institutions and festivals as well. So I appreciate you've had sort of a keen interest then as well that was kind of maybe arose perhaps slightly organically as well from people kind of commenting on, your position in these spaces on diversity and inclusion in the culture sector more generally. One of the, I mean, you kind of touched on this a little bit. One of the findings that struck me was this 71% figure, that is really nearly 3/4 of the boards and the national kind of cultural bodies in Scotland have no women of colour on them at all. And I wondered whether that was something that surprised you even, or that if you had any reflections on that. It seems like that's already, perhaps there's more women of colour around now than there was, maybe 20 years, 30 years ago. It has improved, but I wonder how much at all in your kind of thought, in your experience.
Well, I don't think it's anywhere near enough diversity, and for some of the reasons that I said previously. I think that, one, people aren't aware of the opportunities, and we worked really hard in recent recruitment rounds in the National Library to diversify our recruitment fields and have more diverse applicants, and we still haven't managed to get any women of colour on our board. It's a really difficult thing, and partly I think because in actual fact there's no it takes a lot out of you being on a board. There's a huge commitment, there's a lot of responsibility. It's very difficult even for people who are in work to be able to, you've got to be able to manage your own diary, you've got to be able to have support of your employer, that they think that's a good thing. You're doing extra work, reading lots of papers. Our board papers we try to keep them down, but they are, over 100 pages plus every time, every quarter. That's a significant commitment. And there's no financial reward for that at all. So I think that those are big challenges in terms of diversity. It's difficult for people, to know about these opportunities, and we need to diversify that kind of discussion and build more awareness in the first place. But secondly, it's really hard ask. It's a big ask for people. And so it tends to suit retired people, I think there's a class issue that we need to think about as well.
Absolutely.
And about integration generally. I think that's a huge issue in Scotland. And so I think it's difficult I think we're trying, but it's actually difficult to jump over those barriers, and we need to do more. Definitely need to do more to have a broader range of people. But even for young people, it's hard to encourage them to apply, and then often they don't have a great experience because it's very difficult to find the time.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard, I think, maybe to envisage themselves in those positions. And as you say, it's a lot of work. God, we're really selling it here, aren't we? It's the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing.
It's really worthwhile though. And another aspect that's tricky is, and this happened to me a little bit when I was on the board of National Library of Scotland, I started sort of bringing up issues about equalities and various things. Another thing is that you can then absorb the sort of emotional labor of becoming the de facto equalities person.
That's
so
right.
Sometimes what we're asking we're asking marginalized people to come and be part of a conversation where they have to take on quite a hefty amount of work and perhaps exposure as well. I think that's really difficult. And I think we need to reflect as a sector, as a society, about the way that we do governance and think about what these barriers are blocking, and about the fact that we might be missing out here.
Absolutely, yeah. That activism role that often falls to women and people from marginalized backgrounds sitting in these spaces, and often being the only person to sort of raise the flag and be like, we need to be having these conversations at this level, is something that we don't address, I don't think, enough in sort of intersectional feminist leadership, and the kind of the toll that can take, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about recruitment and that pipeline is also really interesting. It's something that comes up cross-sectorally, these different barriers, often within institutions themselves, and the kind of financial pressures that they're facing, but also for individuals to try to, we know that if we want to increase the number of or the representation on boards and leadership, we need to be really looking to attract new applications from people from minoritized backgrounds across the workforce. And that's, how we sort of filter up. And then that has a knock-on impact on potentially on the kind of the content and the stories that we're creating as well. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the intersectional practices that you'd like to see other cultural bodies adopt, maybe some things that you've implemented at the National Library of Scotland yourself or elsewhere, or things that you've seen policies or practices that you've seen work well elsewhere that have had success that would be helpful to implement?
Well, actually, I don't know if you know, but we've received some Heritage Lottery funding to do a research project in this area to look across the sector in Scotland and find out about what the barriers are to diverse recruitment. So my colleague Ellie Muniadi, who's our EDI officer, Ellie's been leading on that work, and we were successful in the first stage of that. And then we've now just last week heard that we've been successful in the next stage. So we're really looking forward to widening that out and finding out, because I think one of the biggest problems is that we make assumptions about what those barriers might be. And to my mind, we haven't actually asked enough people what their experience is and being open to listening to that. I think we do a lot of assuming, and it would be good to turn the tables a little bit on that. In terms of recruitment, even the process to go on to civil service appointed board is very, it's rigorous. And it's an intensive process. And another woman that was on the board with me previously, she was the director of the University Library in Glasgow, and she'd been working for 30 years. She was highly experienced, and she was sharing with me how daunting it felt to go under that process. And I think that's really difficult for us to get the balance right, whether it's on board recruitment or on recruitment of senior leaders or of the workforce, of getting the right balance between being rigorous and having a transparent process that's fair for everyone, and also being open to having different models of working, different ways of working, or thinking about what we judge people on. And I mean, the Nolan principles are the main things that we ask of people from public bodies and boards, and those should be applicable across a range of experience. But often, if we only look at experience in a traditional sense, or education in a traditional sense, we might not be taking account of the barriers that people experience to get to the point that they are in.
Definitely.
Like multiple things that make it not an equal playing field from the beginning. So I really think we need to look at those.
Definitely. I mean, I think, what you're saying about these, about asking people, I think is really key. We go back to assumptions that are made about, what solutions will best attract certain people or certain groups of people. And I think that's fascinating that you're going to be undertaking that bigger piece of research. I'm really excited. I'll need to hook up with Ellie, I think, and
yeah, definitely. I'll put you in touch.
Yeah, do. I'd be really interested to know that. I mean, there are sort of concrete examples of things that people can do that are out there, but it requires that openness to thinking about, asking open-ended questions which allow for expansion on topics where there's a lot less judgment or less sort of expectation of people fitting a certain mold. The language that you use in recruitment is there is research out there looking at different phrases that attract different groups of people differently, and it's such, and there's also pieces of software that you can run recruitment ads through that a lot of people don't use still, to my surprise, to make sure that you're being as neutral as possible, or indeed trying to make sure that you're using language that is going to open things up rather than close down. I think it's Louise O'Meal in The Comedian, isn't it, that talks about how women will often look through a job advertisement and look through and find, like, identify the one that they can't do and then, or don't have the characteristic, and then discount it, whereas men will watch a YouTube video and assume that they can do the role. So I think there's something in that about the language that we choose to use in advertisements and questions as well.
Absolutely. And I think that is also true from a range of diversities, that people might feel more likely to internalize a sense of imposter syndrome, that, oh, that isn't for me. I don't see anyone like me in that role. And therefore, it isn't possible. It's unlikely. I'm probably not going to be able to, and therefore don't apply. So I think that there's a huge kind of drive that we can also do around making people aware that we're open to working there. But when they even if you are successful, we need to make sure that people don't drop out of our organizations through having a bad experience. And therefore, we need to work on internal culture, values, the way that we work, and acceptance of a range of different diversities. And that can be really difficult, particularly for organizations that have where people have worked there for a long time and they're well established, and we haven't got a lot of people leaving and joining. That can be really hard. That's hard work, and we've been doing quite a lot of work on that in the library recently. But I wouldn't want to say that it's easy or that we're even a success story. I think that it's a constant piece of ongoing work. It's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think these things take time. It takes time, but you have to have the openness to having the conversations in the first place. I should say just on that previous point that we don't necessarily, and I'm sure you probably agree with this, subscribe to the notion that it's on women or people from diverse backgrounds to push themselves forward to that the solution is not for them to try to fit a box. It's very much that we break open the box and and that the onus is on institutions to make that happen. But one thing that you have done is we've noticed that there's no gender pay gap at the National Library of Scotland. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about I suppose the journey to get to that point and some of the influencing factors that you've had involved in that.
It's a really interesting one. The library hasn't traditionally had a gap in gender pay, as long as gender pay gap has been measured. I think in the past, and I know from speaking to people who've worked here, generations ago, who we're still in touch with actually, that definitely was a male culture. And obviously, I'm the first woman to be the librarian, if you like, but. There was a sort of hierarchical, traditional, very male, very hierarchical culture. And one of the retired staff from the library said to me before, when I was doing something on feminism and I was asking her about what it was like to be a senior woman at that time, and she said, well, the men accepted you as long as you didn't act like a woman. Like, as long as that you didn't remind them in your room. So in some senses, a lot of women had to sort of act like alpha males at that time who were in senior leadership positions. So I think it's an interesting journey, and I don't want to say that it's all been smooth sailing at the library and it's always been the case. But the library profession in general is a very there are many more women work in the library profession than males. So I think that in a sense, that skews the library and other libraries generally as well, to make it easier to have that no gender pay gap.
Sure, yeah. It's certainly the makeup. We see that in publishing as well, and that's one of the areas in the report as well, where there's more of a kind of a balance in terms of the leadership, as well as possibly within. We haven't looked at gender pay gaps and done an analysis, and maybe that's the next stage, maybe that's next year's report, but one step at a time, I think. So I suppose finally, and I do feel like we could continue talking about this for a long time, but I'm sort of reining myself in. One of the recommendations from the report is that organizations make their own management and leadership data publicly available. So much like gender pay gap, that this information is publicly accessible, perhaps online. I mean, to be honest, that would make my job a lot easier, a researcher's job a lot easier, just in terms of trying to kind of get collate all the information. But mostly, of course, just for transparency purposes and for that practice of self-monitoring and having that data close to hand so that you can kind of set targets and understand where the patterns of and kind of or lack of diversity is. I wonder if there's sort of fairly straightforward. I hesitate to use the word quick wins, but kind of small, or fairly straightforward strategies that you've used or that you've seen elsewhere that cultural organizations could take proactively in Scotland to try to shift these leadership spaces a little bit and to try and change the dynamic there at all.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I think you're right about being open. And, in the library, we're very much about open data and about making our data open as possible. And I do think that would really help. I do know that the target of having 50-50 of women on boards, that has clearly made a difference. And that is why we're seeing that difference reflected now in the numbers of women on board. So I think those kind of high level targets that are coming from the Scottish Government or from other organisations that are advising that we do that or mandating it, actually, they really help drive a different perspective. So I think that's a really quick win. Another is for us to get together and use things like your research to be able to understand this collectively, and talk about this challenge and reach out to others to find out what their experience is and why they aren't applying for these jobs. I mean, I think I'm a visiting professor at Robert Gordon's at the library, the library course, and I think that thinking about from my own profession, it's about building young professionals and having people going into the courses in the first place. Yeah. So if you haven't got diversity in librarianship or in museum courses, then you're not going to have diversity in the profession in the wider range. So I think that's really important to look at as well. I definitely think that one of the recommendations that came out of the first stage of our lottery work is just the way that we do recruitment and the way that we present ourselves as recruiters. It should be slightly different. So making sure that people are aware that we have EDI policies and that we are a welcoming employer, and us doing the groundwork to reach out, I think is really important. I think sharing ideas and being open is critical, and being in listening mode. I mean, too often, as I said before, we shut things down because we don't really listen to what other people are saying, and we make assumptions about what might be helpful and what they might want, but that's clearly doesn't work. Flexible policies really often help, whether it's for women, and actually critically also for any parents. So we obviously we've got flexi time, we have parental leave, there's opportunities for people we've got hybrid working, people can work from home. So in terms of thinking about how people can manage their life better, I think that is a really important element, and one that I've seen change massively over my career. So as I say, when I was a mum, first going on maternity practically didn't exist. I think it was like 6 weeks or something that you got a tiny amount. There was no expectation that your partner would be able to take any time off at all. So, there wasn't that option. So these things that have come in recently have really helped and shifted some of that, and just being reasonable about people's lives and taking people as individuals rather than always thinking about blanket policies, I think is really important.
Yeah, some really valuable things. I mean, I'd like to pick up on all of those, but I certainly think like evaluating some of these policies and looking at and doing the kind of the research, finding the data to like make sure that the interventions that we're putting in place and the changes to policy are targeted, are actually helping and supporting the people that we need them to support, is key. And that kind of expectation led from above is from Scottish Government, and indeed from any position of leadership is important. I love the idea of getting lots of the CEOs and directors of these national cultural bodies together to have like a sort of open listening session to kind of create some dialogue and share best practice. And I don't know, I feel like I'm giving myself work here, but maybe that's something that we need to look at next stage, is to try and build those connections between folk.
Well, maybe we could team up with us on and Ellie's work on the lottery project, because certainly there'll be learning that will come out of that might really, maybe a good time to kind of
definitely
look at that. I think just listening to people with lived experience is really effective.
Absolutely right.
Making change. Another thing just to add is, I mean, I do think nobody wants to feel, and targets are great, and proactive recruitment is good, going actively out to seek people, but I would feel really upset if I thought that I had got this role because I'm a woman or because I have mixed cultural heritage. And I think it's really important that we actually look at making sure that people are secure that they've got there on their merit, because
that's where the culture comes in.
Merit,
Yeah, of course.
And sometimes I feel like people could look back and think, oh, is that kind of a diversity recruitment, and I think that is a really valid concern of people is really important that we
Absolutely.
recruit for skills and the right person as well as being diverse, and that is there's no lack of talent.
No.
It's mainly about us making sure that we make those connections and bring people through. And to that end, I've been a mentor on the Aurora program, which is in HE, which supports women. And I have mixed feelings, to be honest, about some of those programs, because sometimes the narrative is around that perhaps women need support to understand leadership, or they need some leadership training. But actually, that most often it's actually the organization that needs some support to understand the experience of people with marginalized experience.
Absolutely.
So it's more of a flip, I think, and I think we need to flip it round.
I think that's absolutely right. We need to be really careful in the language that we're using to describe the problem and also to describe solutions. And that's exactly sort of what I was, I suppose, getting at a little earlier around the sort of the idea of imposter syndrome being the barrier, because it's not. The problem is never fixing the woman or fixing the marginalized person. The problem is always fixing the system. And, otherwise the onus is always on those who are in the kind of the disadvantaged or the minoritized position to fix themselves, and that's never what we aim for at all. And I think your earlier point about shifted the cultural shift, the attitudinal shift, that preempts those that openness to policy is absolutely key to kind of breaking that wide open, I think. Yeah.
And I must say, I do think that I've been pleased that there has been a shift in my career. I've seen things change quite significantly, particularly in the last 10 years. And while I appreciate that there is a huge amount of more work to do, I do think that we really have made some progress. And that's absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely.
That we can, across the whole of society, I think, politics is more diverse, and people are really understanding the value and importance of hearing from more voices, I think.
I think that's absolutely right. That's certainly our experience. I mean, we'd go mad in this space if it was all doom and gloom. We have to celebrate the wins, and there's such an appetite. People are hungry for change. There's such an appetite to have these conversations and to look, creatively and critically for solutions, and to push things forward. So yeah, I think that's right. We're starting in a good space, but there's more work to be done. I feel like we could keep chatting, but I'm supposed to wrap this up. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for.
I know there's so much to say.
There's so much to say, isn't there? That's right. No, but look, we really appreciate your time. And also for anybody watching, thank you so much for joining us today. You can read the Diversity at the Top report on the EMCC website, and you can follow all new events, exhibitions, and collections on the National Library of Scotland website, which I very much recommend that you check out. There's a great article on there about Muriel's Park right now, which I enjoyed. Support your local library always. And thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.